People ask me sometimes, colleagues who weren't there, younger researchers who've read the declassified fragments, whether I think it could have gone differently, whether there was a moment where the whole thing might have turned. There was. I was in it. And it happened because of a piece of bread. I know how that sounds. 8 billion people alive today. And the pivot was a crust of bread, and a woman too tired and too stubborn to walk away from something small and frightened, huddled against a cave wall in the dark. I'm not asking anyone to find that heroic. I didn't find it heroic at the time. I found it instinctive. Though if you find breathing instinctive, and I've spent 15 years trying to work out whether instinct is enough to build a philosophy on, or whether I just got lucky and the philosophy came later, constructed around the fact of what happened. I was attached to the Wenley Moore facility in late autumn on secondment from my post at Cambridge. Unit had been there 3 weeks already. Brought in by the ministry, after the accident rate climbed past anything the administration could explain away. Not accidents in the usual sense, nobody was falling into machinery. The injuries were psychological. Staff found catatonic in the lower levels. Men who'd worked together for years, suddenly violent with each other. Over nothing. One senior researcher hauled out of a maintenance tunnel, gripping a geological survey map so hard his knuckles had bled through the paper. The official line was stress. The reactor project was behind schedule. The pressure was considerable. Stress was the word they had, and so they used it. Stress doesn't make men forget their own names. Stress doesn't produce the specific vacancy I saw in the eyes of the men they brought up from the lower levels. A vacancy that was not the blankness of trauma but something else. Something I didn't have a category for yet. As if the mind had encountered a piece of information so categorically wrong, so alien to every prior framework it had assembled for understanding the world, that it had simply stopped processing and stood in the place where processing had been. I drove out from Cambridge with one suitcase, and a set of assumptions I had to dismantle one by one over the following weeks. The facility itself was legitimate science. A cyclotron unit feeding a prototype reactor buried 400 feet below the moorland. The whole enterprise aimed at cracking the energy equation that had been consuming government budgets since the war. The Wenley Moore site had been chosen for its geological stability and its distance from population centers. It was a sensible choice. The logic that made it sensible for the reactor also made it sensible, I would come to understand, for other things. Dr. Quinn ran the science side. He was a compact, private man, brilliant in his subdiscipline and ferociously protective of the project's reputation and his own authority over it. On my first day there I understood that he already knew something was wrong and had chosen, for reasons I didn't yet understand, not to say so in any official context. His eyes moved too quickly when certain topics came up. He listened to the wrong parts of conversations, the peripheral details rather than the main substance, in the way of someone who has a secret and is monitoring the room for evidence that others are approaching it. He was not malicious. I want to be clear about that. He was a man who had found something extraordinary and made the catastrophically ordinary choice of trying to keep it for himself. The brigadier ran the military component with the efficient courtesy of a man who has spent his career being the calmest person in any room and knows that the calm is load-bearing. Tall, straight-backed, mustached in the manner of men who joined the officer corps in a particular decade and held the aesthetic commitment. We disagreed about almost everything eventually, but I respected him from the beginning, and I still do. He was honest about what he didn't understand, which in my experience is considerably rarer among men in his position than it ought to be. He didn't pretend to a confidence he lacked. He asked questions that indicated he'd thought about the problem before arriving. These are not trivial virtues. The facility had a full complement of administrative and scientific staff. Dr. Lawrence, the project director, a small, tightly wound man who managed the pressure of the project by refusing to acknowledge that pressure existed. Miss Dawson, Quinn's assistant, who knew more than she said for reasons of her own. Hawkins, a capable unit captain who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in nearly every critical moment of what followed. And the reactor itself, humming its enormous steady hum 400 feet down, producing power and consuming power in a ratio that should have been fixed and was not. The question of where the power was going. The reactor should have been drawing a consistent load. Instead it cycled. Periods of normal operation interrupted by sudden draws that the engineers couldn't source to any failure in the system. Something below the facility was consuming energy. Not stealing it in any mechanical sense, not tapping into lines, consuming it the way a living system consumes energy, drawing warmth from the rock, using the heat differential of an enormous machine to do something the rock had not been warm enough to do on its own in a very long time. Caves under Wenley Moor run deep and old. The geological surveys were contradictory in ways that should have flagged the site for additional investigation, and instead were filed as measurement error, because measurement error is a comfortable explanation, and what the surveys were actually indicating was not. Passages that appeared on one survey were absent from another. Chambers that the 1963 geological assessment had mapped as solid rock showed up in subsequent surveys as open space. The rock, in other words, was not behaving the way sealed, undisturbed rock behaves. It had been interfered with, very carefully, very precise, over what I later came to understand was an enormous period of time. Someone had been maintaining those passages. The locals had stories, of course. Hill farmers and their families. People who had lived on that moorland for generations, who had watched the facility go up and had opinions about it, expressed with the particular careful reticence of people who know that what they believe will not be received with respect. Animals going missing on the high ground, sounds from the earth on still nights. One family, a man named Squires and his wife, had seen something on the moor 18 months earlier, had reported it. Report was in the file. The notation beside it said, "See attached psychological assessment." The psychological assessment was not attached. I filed all of this and said nothing to anyone, except the notebook I kept in cipher, which is a habit I developed during doctoral work in a competitive laboratory, and have maintained ever since. It was Quinn who died first. They found him 3 days after he went missing, in the lower access tunnel that connected the facility's deepest maintenance level to the cave system. Nobody on the official staff had acknowledged was there. He'd made it almost to the surface before whatever he'd seen caught up with him. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest, which was technically accurate, and also nearly useless as information. A stopped heart tells you that something stopped it, and nothing about what that something was. His face, in the photographs they showed me, because they needed my professional assessment of the physiological evidence, carried an expression I had no framework for at the time. I developed a framework later. It was the expression of a man who had encountered something that rearranged every category he'd ever used to understand the world, and hadn't survived the rearrangement. Not the expression of fear exactly, something beyond fear. The expression of a mind that has just had its most fundamental assumptions proven wrong, and didn't have the architecture to absorb that proof and keep functioning. I went into the caves the following morning. I want to be careful here, because I've told this story before in various controlled contexts, and the temptation is always to reconstruct myself as braver than I was, to give the narrative the shape that feels right, rather than the shape that's accurate. I wasn't brave. I was curious, which is a different thing entirely. Curiosity doesn't properly account for the possibility of consequences, whereas bravery requires you to account for them and proceed anyway. I was also in honesty frightened. The specific type of frightened you get when every rational model you've built for a situation is visibly failing to explain it. And you have to go find the actual explanation before someone else dies. And you understand that the explanation is going to be something that rewrites everything you thought you understood about where you are and what you're dealing with. I told no one where I was going. That was not brave either. That was the decision of a woman who knew that if she told someone where she was going, they would tell her not to go, and she would have to agree that they were right and not go, and the explanation would not get found. So I didn't tell anyone. The caves were cold and smelled of deep time. That is not a poetic phrase. It is the most accurate description I have for what hit me when I moved past the reinforced door at the bottom of the maintenance level and into the natural rock, a mineral damp that has nothing to do with recent water. That is the exhalation of rock that has been sealed for longer than the word ancient was designed to contain. There is a quality of air in places that have been closed for geological time that I have never encountered anywhere else, and that I still cannot fully describe. It is heavy in a way that has nothing to do with humidity. It has weight, presses against the surface of the skin in a way that feels almost communicative, as if the air itself is carrying information about the scale of what preceded it. My torch made a poor accounting of the dark. The passages ran wide, then narrowed, then opened again into chambers the survey maps had not recorded, chambers that had clearly been shaped, the walls too regular, the ceiling heights too consistent, to be the product of natural erosion. Something had been here. Something had cut these passages and shaped these chambers with deliberate precision, and had done so with technology that left marks in the stone I couldn't identify with any tool set I knew. The marks were not primitive. They were exactly as sophisticated as they needed to be, which is how things look when the creature making them has been making them for a very long time and has no interest in decoration. I heard it before I saw it. Breathing, slow and deliberate, not the rhythm of any mammal I'd trained on, or any animal I'd encountered in fieldwork. Something with a different relationship to oxygen, something whose respiratory architecture, I would later understand, had been refined by 60 million years of evolution into a configuration that could sustain full consciousness at a metabolic rate. No mammal reaches outside of hibernation. Torpor breathing, but active. The breathing of something that had surfaced slowly from a very long sleep and was now fully awake, if not yet fully acclimatized. I turned a corner in the passage where the rock curved and the torch beam caught a carved alcove to the left and stopped. The facilities briefings, such as they were at that stage, consisting primarily of Quinn's careful omissions, had used the word creature. It is a word that does a great deal of work when you don't have better language, and it does that work badly, because it implies a category distinction that I understood instantly to be wrong. What I saw was not a creature in the way a wolf is a creature, or a crocodile is a creature. Something organized around instinct and appetite, something whose intelligence, however genuine, operates within a bandwidth we find legible and therefore manageable. What I saw was a person. The category arrived without deliberation, with the speed of true things, and did not leave room for argument. Bipedal, roughly my height, perhaps slightly less, covered in scales of a blue-gray-green coloration that caught my torchlight in a way that suggested iridescence beneath the grime of whatever centuries they'd been accumulating. A third eye in the center of the forehead, currently closed. Two larger eyes, placed differently than human eyes, with a wider field of vision implied by the placement. Open and active, regarding me with an intelligence that I felt as something close to physical pressure, not threatening pressure. The pressure of being genuinely seen by something that is genuinely looking. It was young. I recognize this in the way you recognize youth in any intelligent creature. Proportions not yet settled. The particular quality of alertness that belongs to something that hasn't had long enough to develop full caution. Were smaller than the adults I encountered later, lighter in its movements, with something in its bearing that I can only describe as not yet weighted down. It was pressed back into the carved alcove with the posture I know from clinical contexts in any species. Energy conservation, pain management, the contracted stillness of a system under stress. There was an injury to one of its forelegs. The scaling was disrupted across a section of perhaps 15 centimeters, the edges of the disruption ragged in a way that indicated force rather than surgical precision, the wound itself seeping something darker than I expected blood to be. Fall, I thought, or a fight, or the edge of a passage narrower than anticipated. Something had caught it wrong, and it was waiting for the hurt to become manageable. It saw me. The large eyes tracked me with complete attention. It did not move. I had a field kit in my bag, because that is what I carry when I go anywhere that might produce an injury requiring field management, which is everywhere. I also had, in the side pocket of my coat, half a protein bar in foil that I'd been carrying for 3 days and not eaten, and a heel of bread from that morning's breakfast, stuffed into my pocket, in the absent way of someone who grew up in a household where food was not thrown away, and the habit had never fully left. I did not think. I want to be precise about this, because I have been asked about it many times, and the temptation, in retrospect, is to impose a deliberate logic on what was actually instinctive. I did not think. This creature will respond to a gesture of offering, and this will establish positive rapport. I did not think. The sharing of food is a cross-cultural communication of non-hostility. I sat down on the cave floor, slowly with the conscious deliberation I use when I want to make my physical intentions readable. And I took the bread out of my coat pocket, and I set it on the rock between us. The gesture was the one my grandmother made for birds on a window ledge, which is a completely inadequate frame of reference for what was happening in that cave, and is nonetheless the honest frame of reference. Commanding, not bargaining, not calculating, just offering here. I have something. You can have it if you want it. No condition attached. We stayed like that for a long time. The torchlight held, the cold pressed in. The breathing on the other side of the bread was the only sound. Then the creature reached forward, very slowly, with 3 fingered hands that were jointed differently than mine, but moved with a precision that made the difference in architecture irrelevant, and took the bread. It didn't eat immediately. It held the bread and examined it with a focused, systematic attention that was, again, entirely legible to me. The attention of a mind cataloging an unknown object, cross-referencing it against a database of known things, making a determination about what it was and whether it was safe, and what the appropriate response to it was. There was nothing primitive about this process. It was recognizably scientific. Then it ate, small, precise bites, watching me throughout, not with fear, but with the unwavering attention of an intelligence gathering information. I opened the field kit. Looking at the wound from across the distance between us, I could see that it needed cleaning at minimum, and probably better dressing than the wound had received, if it had received any dressing at all. I took out the antiseptic, and the gauze, and the secondary dressing material, and set them on the rock beside me, one at a time, slowly enough that each item was visible and had time to register before the next appeared. Then I looked at the creature. Then I looked at the wound. It watched me do this. It went still. The second kind of still, not the stillness of an animal that freezes because motion triggers predation response, but the stillness of a thinking being that has paused its physical self while its mental self runs a calculation. I have seen this stillness in human patients who are deciding whether to trust a doctor they have just met. Quality of it is identical, regardless of the species doing it, which tells you something about what intelligence is underneath its various expressions. The calculation took a few seconds, and it moved its forelegs slightly toward me, not dramatically, not far, just enough to change the geometry of the space between us. An opening. I moved forward slowly and looked at the wound directly. The architecture of the injury was unlike anything in my training. The scaling served functions that skin doesn't serve in mammals. The tissue beneath it was organized differently. The biochemistry was going to be, as I would eventually understand, significantly outside my reference range, but the wound itself was legible in its basics. Open, contaminated from contact with the cave floor, in need of cleaning and protection. The principles of field wound management don't require species-specific knowledge. They require understanding what the injury is doing and slowing it down. I cleaned the wound as carefully as I could manage. I talked through what I was doing in a low, steady voice. Not because I thought the creature understood English syntax, but because silence in that context felt like a concealment, and I was not concealing anything. The cleaning took longer than it would have taken on a human, because I was working around an architecture I didn't know, guessing at tolerances I hadn't been trained to assess, stopping whenever the creature made any sound or movement, to wait and see what that sound or movement was. It was never withdrawal. It was always the kind of adjustment that bodies make when dealing with something painful. The involuntary accommodation of discomfort, which is different from resistance. When I was done, I applied a field dressing as best I could manage. The gauze didn't adhere the way it would to mammalian skin, but it stayed well enough. The creature looked at its foreleg for a moment, then looked at me. It made a sound. Low, complex below the register, where human speech operates, with harmonics in it that I felt in my sternum more than I heard with my ears. I have no idea what it said. I have theories, most of them constructed retrospectively in the light of what followed, none of them verifiable. What I know is that it looked directly at me when it said whatever it said, and it held the look for a moment. After the sound finished, the way you hold a look when you want to be sure that what you've communicated has landed. Then it moved back into the dark of the passage. I sat on the cave floor with my empty field kit and my foil wrapper, and the torch beginning to make worrying flickers at the edge of its beam, and I tried to take stock of what had just happened. I managed several minutes of stock-taking before the adrenaline that had been standing at the edge of the previous hour decided. This was the appropriate moment to make itself known, and my hands began shaking with the particular fine tremor that follows extended periods of pretending to be calm. I let them shake. I breathed. I picked up everything I'd brought in and I went back to the surface. I wrote everything down. The following 2 weeks moved quickly in some ways and very slowly in others. The discovery of the POV complex by the military units changed the character of the situation entirely. What had been a mysterious drain on a reactor's power supply and a set of unexplained psychological injuries became, overnight, a strategic encounter with an intelligence that the human race had no framework for. The brigadier, to his credit, neither panicked nor pretended. The situation was simpler than it was. He sent messages up the chain, received inadequate responses, and did the best he could with the resources and latitude he had. Contact was established with the creature's leadership through a process that was complicated by the fact that the creatures had their own internal politics, and those politics were not monolithic. Two voices dominated what communications we were able to establish. The elder was the older of the two, ancient by the standards of his own people, whose natural lifespan I eventually came to understand extends to lengths that would make the word ancient seem modest in human context. He communicated a willingness to engage, a recognition that time had passed and that the world above had changed in ways that could not be simply reversed. He had the philosophical equipment to hold the complexity of the situation without resolving it into a simple conclusion. He didn't want peace because he was weak. He wanted it because he had lived long enough to understand what the alternative cost. And the cost was one he was no longer willing to pay without first exhausting every other option. The younger figure communicated something different. He was not, I think, stupid. None of them were stupid. And the younger Silurian had a kind of brilliant, ferocious certainty that, in other circumstances, I might have found admirable. But he had arrived at his certainty by a route that didn't account for moral complexity, which is a route available to the intelligent as well as the unintelligent. He saw a world that had been taken. He saw a species, ours, that had been permitted to develop and multiply on land that was not rightfully theirs. He saw no obligation to accept that as a permanent condition. He was not wrong about the history. He was wrong about what the history required. The elder tried to hold the line between dialogue and escalation. The younger faction built pressure against him. Every interaction the humans initiated that went wrong, every military patrol that entered cave territory that the creatures considered non-negotiable, every moment of contact that ended in violence, fed the younger faction's argument that negotiation was a strategic error. The younger faction killed the elder before negotiation had run its course. I wasn't in the caves when it happened. I was in the upper laboratory reviewing power draw data when the brigadier came in with the report. The elder had been found in the lower cave system. The third eye that functioned as both sense organ and weapon, dark and cold, killed by a discharge from one of his own people's technology. No external intervention, an internal political resolution, final and non-negotiable. The younger faction consolidated in hours, and within 12 hours of the consolidation, the first cases appeared in London. A civil servant named Masters had been at the facility the previous week, in a capacity I was never fully briefed on. He had driven back to London not knowing he was carrying anything. Pathogen, we called it that because we needed a word, not because we fully understood what it was yet, had an incubation period of approximately 72 hours, during which the carrier was fully infectious and entirely asymptomatic. Masters was a methodical man who used public transport. He had attended 2 meetings. He had eaten lunch in a busy restaurant. By the time he collapsed in a train station, and the symptoms became unmistakable, the pathogen was distributed through the London Underground network in a way that made containment, in any traditional sense, a theoretical exercise. Masters died, the rate of new cases doubled, then doubled again. I understood what I was looking at, in those first numbers, in a way that felt physical. There is a quality to the progression of a genuine catastrophic outbreak, a momentum, a shape to the curve, that I had studied in academic contexts and now recognized as lived experience. Curve had that shape. Projections, once we had enough data points to run them, showed a terminal global saturation time of 11 weeks at the observed spread rate. 11 weeks before the pathogen had touched every human population on the surface of the planet. We had no framework. The bacterial architecture was not in any database we had access to. Evolutionary structure, 60 million years removed from anything terrestrial microbiology had cataloged, organized according to principles that our models didn't predict, because our models had been built from a sample of life that had only existed, relative to this pathogen's designers, for the briefest possible time. Standard antibiotics were designed to exploit vulnerabilities in bacterial biology that this organism didn't have, because it had been engineered by a biology that understood vulnerabilities and had designed around them. Electron microscopy showed us what it looked like. It didn't show us what to do about it. I worked for 51 hours without meaningful sleep. I've been asked whether that was a choice, and the honest answer is that it was less a choice than an absence of alternative. When the work is the only available response to a situation, and the work doesn't have an endpoint, you work until you reach the endpoint, or until your body makes the decision for you. Mine made the decision eventually, but not before I'd built a partial model of the pathogen's structure, identified several proteins that looked like candidate targets, and understood enough about the engineering logic to know that whoever built this had also built a way to neutralize it. Engineered pathogens designed as weapons have counters. That is not idealism, it is engineering logic. You don't deploy something you can't stop if it reaches the wrong targets. There was a counteragent, somewhere. The creature from the cave appeared at the lower access grate on the third night of the outbreak. I got the call at 2 a.m. from the guard on duty, who had been standing his post for 6 hours and was tired and baffled, and reported it with the flat precision of a man who has decided that being baffled is not professionally appropriate, and is choosing precision as the available alternative. Something at the gate, not aggressive, present, unmoving. He'd been watching it for 20 minutes, and it hadn't done anything except wait. I dressed, took my notebook, and went down. The foreleg was healing. I could see that before anything else. The dressing I'd applied was partially in place, dark and adhered the way dressings adhere when a wound is closing under them. The creature stood in the red emergency lighting on the other side of the grate, and looked at me with the same complete, undefensive attention it had given me in the cave. I pulled a chair to the grate and sat down and opened the notebook. 4 hours. I will not pretend we communicated efficiently. We communicated the way two intelligent systems communicate when they share no common language, no common symbol set, and no guaranteed overlap in sensory reference. Laboriously, with enormous tolerance for ambiguity, building a grammar from scratch out of repetition and gesture, and the painstaking process of testing whether what you've understood is what was meant. The creature was a better communicator than I was, in the technical sense, more patient, more precise in its repetitions, more attentive to the signals that I'd understood versus the signals that I'd misread. I was learning from it as much as I was communicating with it. There were factions in the cave system, I eventually understood. The political consolidation had not been as complete as the younger leader believed. The elder's death had created a silence, not a consensus. And something in that silence, something that remembered the elder's argument, that had not been convinced by his death that the argument was wrong, had made a decision. It had the counteragent, not in language, in chemistry. The structure of the compound that would neutralize the pathogen, drawn, with the claw of one three-fingered hand, in careful on the surface of the grate between us. Molecular structures, binding sites, the sequential steps of a synthesis pathway, that would have been elegant even by human organic chemistry standards, and which was, by the standards of chemistry that had 60 million years more development behind it, probably considered elementary. I copied every line into the notebook, checking each segment by pointing to what I'd written and waiting for a response. Correct or incorrect. It knew which was which. The notation system was partly translatable and partly not. I had to extrapolate several steps in the middle, use analogs from human biochemistry, where the alien notation exceeded my capacity to read it directly. Compounds I recognized immediately as related to things already in our reference libraries. Modified in ways that made structural sense once I understood the target mechanism. 3 others required 3 hours of additional lab work after the conversation ended. When I pressed my hand flat against the grate and it pressed its 3-fingered hand against the other side of the same metal, I understood the exchange that had just happened. I went back to the lab, and I did not sleep again for another 19 hours. The synthesis required 2 other researchers who had better practical chemistry skills than I did in certain steps of the process, and the brigadier cut through the administrative obstruction that would otherwise have delayed field deployment by days we genuinely did not have. The manufacturing scale-up was a problem the Ministry of Health managed with speed I have never seen them achieve before or since, which is what organizations are capable of when the alternative is the end of the species they were created to serve. The treatment went into deployment. Within 22 hours of my conversation at the grate, the outbreak curve began to change within 4 days. Within 2 weeks, London's case numbers were falling. 8 billion people. I keep returning to that number because mathematics doesn't soften things. Projections had 11 weeks. We had at the point the counter-agent went into production. Approximately 10 days left in that window. 10 days to spare, 10 days total. 10 days was what remained between the spread rate we were observing and the point at which the curve goes vertical and the response capacity of any human institution becomes irrelevant. 8 billion people alive because an alien creature, young and injured, and existing in a political situation that gave it every reason to let us die, decided that what had happened between us in a cave, a woman sitting on rock and offering what she had, was worth the risk of coming back. The military action came on the 4th day after the cure went into full deployment. I was not informed in advance. The brigadier and I had argued through most of the preceding week, argued properly, in the sense of 2 people who mean what they say, and whose disagreement is not a misunderstanding but a genuine difference about what circumstances require. I was not wrong that many of the creatures in that cave system had made no individual decision to harm anyone. I was not wrong that the elder had sought peace and had been killed for it, and that the faction that killed him did not represent the only politics in that community. I was not wrong that something in those caves had given us the compound that saved 8 billion people. He was not wrong that the younger faction's leadership had released a pathogen intended to destroy the human species, and had come very close to succeeding. He was not wrong that he had no reliable way of knowing which individuals in the cave system belonged to which faction, or what the political situation underground would look like in another week, or whether the counter-agent being in human hands now reduced or eliminated the leverage that had produced it. He had a security responsibility that I did not have to carry, and he carried it. The demolition charges brought down the primary cave complex in a series of detonations that we felt on the surface as a sustained low trembling, the earth itself absorbing something it had not been asked to absorb. Every individual in the hibernation chambers died. The young leader, the remnants of his faction, creatures who had disagreed with him. Whatever individual had come to a metal grate at 2 in the morning, carrying a molecular sequence drawn from 60 million years of biological knowledge, and given it to a woman on the other side because of something that happened in a cave. All of them. The rock settled over them. The earth went quiet. The brigadier's face, when I found him on the surface afterward, was not triumphant. I want to record that because I think it matters. He looked like a man who has made the only decision available to him within the logic of his position, and who understands that the logic of his position has costs, and who is beginning to understand that some costs don't present their full invoice immediately. He looked like a man who will be paying that invoice for a long time. I drove back to London 3 days later along empty moorland roads, the ministry keeping civilian traffic off the main routes, while various operations concluded. At one point I stopped the car on a rise, where the facility's chimney stacks were visible in the middle distance, small against a gray November sky that was doing nothing to make the scene more bearable. I sat there for a while. I watched the stacks. I tried to locate what I was feeling with enough precision to name it. Grief, I think. That is the closest word I have. Not the sharp grief of an immediate loss that had a different texture. Something longer and slower. The grief of knowing that something irreplaceable has ended, and that the ending was final, and that the reason it ended was only partly the result of choices that couldn't have gone differently. Partly it ended because of choices that could have. I think about the caves often 15 years on. The carved alcove. The torchlight on iridescent scale. Quality of the silence down there. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of accumulated time, of 60 million years compressed into the spaces between stone. I think about the elder's attempt to hold a line against a conclusion that perhaps was never avoidable. I think about what he said in the brief period when communication was working. That his people had a concept with no direct human equivalent, which the researcher translating for us rendered as the first gesture. The foundational act that establishes whether two parties are in a relationship or in a confrontation. The move that once made determines the shape of everything that follows. He said his people had been waiting, since they woke, to understand which one they were in. I don't know what conclusion he reached before the end. Something in that cave system made its own determination, separately, and acted on it. Something young, with a healing wound and a dangerous political context, and no guarantee that the choice it was making would be anything other than fatal, decided that the woman who had sat on the cave floor and offered bread was in a relationship rather than a confrontation, and it acted on that. I was not heroic. I was a scientist who hadn't eaten her breakfast properly and found it in her pocket in a cave. I sat down on rock, because standing over something injured and frightened seemed wrong in a way I couldn't fully articulate and didn't particularly need to. I offered what I had. It was not a strategy. It was not a diplomatic gambit. It was the simplest human thing I know how to do, which is see something that hurts and try to help it. The world kept breathing because of that. I understand that this is not a satisfying conclusion to the kind of story people expect about a near-extinction event. People expect the story of humanity prevailing through ingenuity, through force of will, through the application of superior firepower or superior science to an overwhelming threat. And we did apply science eventually. The science would have had nothing to apply itself to, if not for a moment in a cave that preceded all of it by 3 weeks. A moment that had no scientific logic, no strategic calculation, no plan. I've stopped trying to extract a philosophy from it. The philosophy keeps coming out the same way, which is too simple to be trusted. That what you do before you know what's at stake determines what's available to you when you find out. That the small acts precede the large ones and make them possible. That something in the gap between species, enormous, possibly unbridgeable, freighted with history that neither party can fully account for, can be crossed by a gesture that costs almost nothing if the gesture is honest. I don't know if that's enough to build a civilization on. I suspect it is, and I suspect it doesn't matter whether it's enough, because it's what we have. Some of the researchers who were at Wenley Moor still gather occasionally. We don't discuss it directly at these meals. Clearance implications. And also the fact that direct discussion tends to arrive very quickly at a silence that has no good exit. We stay late. We refill our glasses, and we sit in the particular quiet of people who watched the world nearly end and came back from it permanently altered. Not in any way that is visible or that would satisfy a clinician, but altered nonetheless. We're still here. That will have to be enough. There are things I should record more carefully about the days between the first contact, because I've noticed that the account tends to compress them in my tesseling, and the compression makes the situation sound more inevitable than it was. It was not inevitable. At multiple points, it was something else entirely, contingent, balanced, capable of going differently, and I want to be honest about that. Not because it makes the ending easier to bear, but because honesty about contingency is the only thing that teaches anything. The morning after my visit to the cave, I went to the brigadier and told him what I'd found. This was not a straightforward conversation. Brigadier had been managing, for the past 3 weeks, a facility full of people who had no satisfactory explanation for the power drain, the psychological injuries, or the disappearances. He had sent patrol units into the lower cave access and gotten most of them back reporting either nothing or something they couldn't describe in military terms, which in a soldier is its own kind of testimony. He had been collating these reports and trying to build a coherent picture of what his unit was dealing with. He had not been entirely successful because the picture required a category of thing that his training had not included. What I told him required that category. I told him flatly, in clinical language, what I had observed: the alcove, the injury, the act of offering food, the response, the wound treatment and its acceptance, the communication attempt, limited as it was. I told him, I believed we were dealing with an intelligent species, territorial and cautious, that had been disturbed from a state of extended dormancy by the reactor's heat output, and that the disturbance had been ongoing long enough for them to have developed opinions about us. He listened without interrupting. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise and relevant. Then he was quiet for a moment, the specific silence of a man reorganizing his understanding of a situation around new information. He said, "And you think they can be talked to?" I said, "I think something in there already decided to let me leave." That, I think, was the moment when the brigadier decided to hold his more aggressive options in reserve for as long as he could manage. He was not a patient man by temperament. He was a man who had learned patience as a discipline, which is different and more reliable. Because learned disciplines are available under pressure in ways that natural temperament is not. He held his options. He pressed the ministry for clearance to attempt formal contact. He argued against the institutional skepticism of people who hadn't been in that facility that shooting first was not the only available response, and possibly not the advisable one. He got some latitude, not as much as I would have liked. Enough. Formal contact was attempted the following week by a researcher with more xenolinguistics background than I had, a man named Whitfield, who had spent his career studying non-human animal communication systems, and who adapted, with impressive speed, to the task of trying to establish a shared grammar with something several orders of magnitude further outside his reference range than anything he'd previously worked with. He built a preliminary vocabulary of about 60 units over 4 days. 60 units is barely enough to communicate intent, let alone position. But intent was what mattered at that stage. The elder's intent was peace. Not peace in the sense of capitulation, not a surrender of claim or history or pride. Peace in the sense of a species that has been awake for long enough in a changed world to understand that the world being changed is not a reversible condition, and that the available choices do not include reversing it. He communicated the history of his people with a dignity that Whitfield struggled to fully capture, and that I reconstructed from the partial transcripts months later. The civilization that had preceded ours, the decision to enter hibernation, the capture calculation that proved wrong, the awakening into a world so different from the one they'd left that it had required weeks of simply processing the difference before they were capable of anything else. He was not asking for the surface back. He was asking for a conversation about what coexistence looked like. About what the humans intended to do with the knowledge that they were not the first intelligent species to develop on this planet, and about whether the species currently occupying the surface was capable of sharing it. These are not simple questions. They are not questions that the Ministry of Defense or any other part of the British government was structured to answer quickly. Conversations that should have been happening at the highest levels of government were happening instead in briefings, where the information was being received by people whose primary response was to ask whether this could be contained and managed, which is not the same question and does not lead to the same place. The younger faction watched all of this with the patience of something that had already decided the outcome, and was waiting to see whether the elders' approach would delay it or alter it. I understand, in retrospect, that the younger leader was not simply aggressive. He was applying a cold and methodical logic that had a specific historical basis. His people had gone to sleep as the dominant intelligence on this planet. They had woken to find the planet occupied, their systems failing, their population a fraction of what it had been, and the occupying species in possession of nuclear technology. From where he stood, the arithmetic was straightforward. The longer the conversation continued, the more time the mammals had to prepare. The elders' approach was not peace. It was, by the younger faction's analysis, a delay that benefited only the enemy. He was not entirely wrong about the logic. He was wrong about the conclusion the logic required. That's a distinction that requires a framework for valuing things beyond survival. And frameworks require time to build. And he had been awake for a matter of weeks in a world that had overwritten everything he'd previously known. His tolerance for complexity was not infinite. Nobody's is. The question is always whether you encounter the limits of your tolerance before or after the moment that matters. He killed the elder on a Thursday. Whitfield called me at 7 in the evening. I remember the light in the corridor outside the communications room, the particular quality of late afternoon sun through institutional glass. The way the news arrived so matter-of-factly that it took several seconds to fully process. Political transition was complete before Friday morning. The plague was in London by Saturday. I have been asked in the years since whether the elder's death was the point of no return. Whether, if he had survived, the outcome might have been different. I don't know. I think the younger faction had enough support that the elder's death, if not that week, would have come another week. I think the structural forces were working toward the outcome that occurred. But I also know that structures are made of individual decisions, and individual decisions are made by individuals, and individuals sometimes surprise you. The elder had been surprising his own people for years. He might have continued to. We will not know. What I know is that I had 4 hours on the third night of the plague at a grate in a basement corridor, with a creature that had come back. And those 4 hours were the hinge point of everything. I've described the communication itself already. What I haven't described is the quality of the experience, what it felt like to be on my side of the grate, working across that gap with the inadequate tools available to us. There is a particular mental state that comes from extended high-stakes communication under conditions of radical uncertainty, a kind of suspended intensity, where your attention becomes very narrow and very clear, where the usual peripheral noise of thought goes quiet, and what remains is just the problem and the next thing you can try. I've experienced it in clinical emergencies, in research dead ends that required creative reorientation, in arguments where everything depended on finding the right word. I experienced it at the grate in a form more complete than I had before. The creature was patient, extraordinarily patient. Patient in a way that made me wonder whether patience for a species whose history spans geological time has a different texture than it does for ours. We run out of patience in minutes, sometimes seconds. We feel its depletion as a physical sensation. Whatever the creature was experiencing, it didn't show any sign of a depletion limit. It repeated structures until I'd copied them correctly. It corrected my errors without any apparent frustration at the need to correct them. It gave me time, over and over, in quantities that I, with my human awareness of how long everything was taking, and how many people were getting sick while we sat there, found difficult to accept gracefully. At one point, perhaps 2 hours in, I made an error in my notation that would have been catastrophic, transposed 2 elements in a binding sequence in a way that would have produced an inactive compound. I copied it confidently and moved to the next segment. The creature stopped, waited, then traced the sequence again, slowly, and placed a claw specifically on the transposed elements without touching them. I looked at my notation. I found the error. I corrected it. The creature waited until I had, then continued. I think about that correction often. The creature had no way of knowing whether I'd understood the implications of the error, or whether I'd understood that it was pointing out an error rather than repeating for another reason. It could only do the same thing again more deliberately and trust that I'd find the problem. It trusted that, with no particular basis for that trust beyond what had happened in a cave It trusted that if it showed me the problem again, I'd find it. I'd like to say something is philosophically significant about that, but I think what it actually is simple. It was trying to help me. It had decided to help me. Having decided, it was applying itself to the task with the full intelligence available to it, which was considerable. And full intelligence applied to helping someone without reservation or calculation about what the help costs is one of the more remarkable things I've encountered in my professional life, regardless of whose intelligence it is. And I pressed my hand against the grate at the end. The metal was cold from 4 hours of basement air. Creature's hand on the other side was warmer than I expected. I had from the scaling and the biology, that it would be cold-blooded in the reptilian sense, but the temperature at the grate told me the biology was more complex than that. The hands were the same size roughly. The structure was very different. The pressure was the same. Then it was gone, back into the corridor and the dark, and I was alone, with a notebook full of molecular structures and a bone-deep understanding of what I had to do next. The treatment worked because the chemistry was right. The chemistry was right because the notation was right. The notation was right because I'd spent 4 hours at a grate being corrected patiently and without reproach every time I got something wrong. The correction that prevented the lethal transcription error happened because the creature, having decided to help me completely, not strategically, not partially, not with conditions attached. I keep trying to find the lesson in that, and I keep arriving at the same place. The lesson is that things that are given without calculations tend to have the quality of completeness that calculated things lack. The elder had a calculation. The younger leader had a calculation. The creature at the grate, I believe, did not. It had a decision. The decision was based on a memory of bread in a cave and a woman on a rock floor, and something that had felt when it happened, like being seen rather than assessed. From that decision, it derived everything it subsequently did, without calculating whether the return was sufficient. 8 billion people. I don't know what the creature's name was. I never learned enough of the vocal system to even ask, and there was no time to develop that capacity before the end. It exists in my notebook as a series of molecular structures, and a date, and a description of a 3-fingered hand pressed against a grate in the dark. It exists in human history as a component of a classified file that will not be available to the public for at least 50 years. It existed, it made a choice. The choice saved us. That is in the record. Regardless of who has access to the record, regardless of whether it is ever widely known, I think it deserves to be known. I think what happened in those caves, both the terrible things and the extraordinary ones, deserves a full account, not because it makes us look good, or because it makes them look good, but because it actually happened, and things that actually happen are the only material any of us have to work with when we try to understand what we are, and what we might be. Still here. Something in the dark gave us that. It seems worth knowing about. There is one more thing I haven't said, because I wasn't sure it was relevant, and then I decided it was. In the days immediately after the demolition, when the facility was being wound down and the last of the ministry oversight teams were completing their documentation, I went back to the cave entrance, not down into the system, which was sealed and would remain sealed, but to the entrance itself, the mouth of the passage I'd walked into that first morning. The rock around the entrance was undisturbed. The explosives had been placed deep enough that the surface geology was unaffected. It looked like a natural opening in the moorland. The kind of thing you step around without thinking about it. I stood there for a while. I didn't have anything to say or do. I just stood there. I had been thinking about what the elder communicated in our brief period of genuine exchange, the concept he called the first gesture, the foundational act, and I had been thinking about whether what happened in that cave could be considered a first gesture, and what it meant that the first gesture had been made not by a diplomat or a soldier or any person with a mandate, but by a woman who sat down on rock because standing over something injured seemed wrong, and who had bread in her pocket because her grandmother taught not to waste food. First gestures are supposed to be deliberate. They are supposed to be made by people who understand what is at stake and choose, from a position of understanding, to act. The first gesture at Wenley Moore was made by someone who understood nothing except that a thing was hurt and she could do something about it. The understanding came later. The gesture came first. I don't think that undermines the gesture. I think it might be the point of the gesture. The things we do before we know what's at stake reveal what we actually are, underneath the strategic layer, underneath the professional identity and the institutional affiliation, and the carefully maintained self-presentation. What we do when we just do something, when the action precedes the calculation, that's the information that matters. We had 6 billion people at the time. The projections now say 8 billion. The population has grown since then as it does. All of them alive. All of them breathing the same air that the creatures engineered bacteria would have stripped from their lungs inside 11 weeks. All of them going about their lives, most of them without any knowledge of what almost happened, and without any knowledge of what stopped it. Somewhere in the decision chain that produced that outcome is a piece of bread on a cave floor, and a woman too tired to calculate whether giving it was strategically advisable. I've decided I'm at peace with that. Took me a while to get there. The version of myself that values rigor and methodology and deliberate action has some objections to a world saved by an accident of character. The objections don't change the facts. The facts are what they are. And the fact that the pivot was small and unconsidered doesn't make it less of a pivot. It makes it more interesting, in the way that the things that survive our scrutiny are always more interesting than the things that require protection from it. Still here, that's what I know, that's what I carry. And on the days when it's difficult to carry, when the classified files and the absence of any public acknowledgement, and the particular loneliness of knowing something that cannot be shared, make the weight of it feel unreasonable. I think of a 3-fingered hand pressed against cold metal on the other side of a grate, patient in the dark, waiting for me to stop making errors. And I think we owed that more than we gave it. And I think, do better. That's all. That's what I have. Still here. And something gave us that. And the least we can do with it is try to deserve it better than we did. On the last day we had the chance.